loud.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Jacqueline Peterson Loomis. I'm the founding director emeritus of the Portland Chinatown Museum, as well as professor emeritus of history from Washington State University. On behalf of the museum, I'd like to welcome you back and others perhaps for the first time to the monthly program of a Hidden History series. As the series project director, I will be your moderator today, assisted by Tracy Kwan, who is a museum board member. The Portland Chinatown Museum acknowledges and honors the indigenous peoples and their descendants of the Lower Columbia and Willamette River regions, whose lands the city of Portland and our museum currently occupy. These include Willamette, Tumwater, Clackamas, Cathlamet, Molalla, Multnomah, and Witlala Chinook tribes, and the Tualatin, who today are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. The Clatsop and the Chinook Nation, both of whom independently occupy lands reserved by the states of Washington and Oregon, respectively, and the many other Chinookan peoples who established communities along the Lower Columbia, whose descendants are today members of the Grand Ronde, Warren Springs, and Silet's Confederated Tribes of Oregon. As all of you know, today is also Juneteenth, which marks the day when federal troops arrived in Galveston, Texas in 1865 to take control of the state and to ensure that its still enslaved people were freed. The troops' arrival came a full 2.5 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Juneteenth honors the end to slavery in the United States and is considered the longest running African-American holiday and our country's second Independence Day. Quoting Henry Louis Gates Jr., of all Emancipation Day observances, Juneteenth falls closest to the summer solstice, the longest day of the year when the sun at its zenith defines the darkness in every state, including those once shadowed by slavery. By choosing to celebrate the last place in the South that freedom touched, reflecting the mystical glow of history and lore, memory and myth, as Ralph Ellison evoked in his posthumous novel, Juneteenth, we remember the shining promise of emancipation, along with the bloody path America took by delaying it and deferring fulfillment of these simple and unanticipated words in General Granger's original order. Quote, "This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves." The program today is part of a series called Hidden Histories, Oregon's Early Chinatowns and Chinese Worker Settlements, which was organized and is moderated by the Portland Chinatown Museum in partnership with Oregon museums, state parks and forests, city governments, and other educational institutions across the state of Oregon. Hidden Histories aims to provide a better understanding of Chinese immigrant history and culture and its importance to Oregon's growing Asian American population by sharing stories, the written record, material culture, and the histories of Oregon's early rural and urban Chinese communities. Hidden Histories was made possible in part by a grant from Oregon Humanities, a statewide nonprofit organization and an independent affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which funds Oregon Humanities grant programs. For 50 years, Oregon Humanities has offered programs and publications that help Oregonians connect, reflect, and learn from one another. I'm now going to turn the microphone over to Tracy Kwan to provide details about today's format, the program, and to introduce its presenters.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Today, we're really lucky to be joined by archaeologist Chelsea Rose, novelist Jessica Shi, and filmmaker Barre Fong. Using Jacksonville, Oregon as a case study, this program will feature a presentation of its archaeology and history, followed by a discussion highlighting the challenges, opportunities, and importance of researching and documenting the stories of early Chinatowns and Chinese American immigrants to Oregon. The presentation will be followed by a short Q&A session that Dr. Peterson Loomis will be hosting. Time permitting, we will also have a short Q&A with our guests to conclude the program. And just as a reminder for everybody, you can use the Q&A to interact with the panelists and the hosts. So if you have any questions, please pop them in there and we will take note of them and try to help out as best we can throughout. If you have any technical issues, please pop them in there as well. I'd like to introduce our presenters today. Chelsea Rose, if you can give a hand wave there. She's a historical archaeologist who focuses on the settlement and development of the American West. She graduated with honors from the University of Oregon and received her graduate degree in Cultural Resources Management from Sonoma State University. She's a principal investigator for the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project, a multi-agency partnership that focuses on the history and education of Oregon's Chinese heritage. This won the 2020 Oregon Heritage Excellence Award. Chelsea regularly works with the media, students, and community volunteers in an effort to promote archaeological awareness and to encourage historical stewardship. She serves on the board of the Oregon Historical Quarterly and is currently chair of the governor-appointed Oregon Heritage Commission. Featured in books and magazines promoting STEM education, her recent book, Chinese Diaspora, Archaeology in North America, is available from the University Press at Florida. And we also have Jessica Shi. Please wave your hand as well. Thank you. She's working on a historical novel about a 19th century Chinese American family in California. Set in San Francisco during the Chinese exclusion, the novel explores family life, intergenerational relationships, ancestry, and how the Chinese undertook one of the earliest mass civil rights movements in the United States. She is also finishing a collection of short stories that explore migration, lineage, and questions of identity and belonging amongst first-generation Chinese Americans. Prior to transitioning into full-time writing, she had 2 decade-long careers in business management and development, investment, and internal consulting. She graduated from Barnard College with a BA in English and creative writing, and she is a McDowell Fellow and the 2020 recipient of the Catherine Min Fellowship. We also have Barre Fong. Barre is a 4th-generation native San Franciscan. He was educated at the University of San Francisco and graduated in 1990. Professionally, Barre has owned and operated a graphic design, photography, and video production studio since 1991, serving local and international clients. His current film, Finding the Virgo, has won multiple awards and will be screened on the West Coast, London, and Paris. Barre is currently producing Celestials, a documentary film tracing Stanford University's groundbreaking research about Chinese railroad workers. Currently serving on the board of trustees of the Lick Wilmerding High School in San Francisco, Barre previously served as the president of the board of directors at the Chinese Historical Society of America. And with that, I'd like to welcome Chelsea on and to share her presentation as well.
Okay, can everybody see that? Oops, yikes. Okay, nod if you can see my screen. Okay, good. All right. Well, thank you so much for having us here. We're excited to be part of this really cool series of talks, and also we really appreciate you joining us today. I know there's no shortage of fantastic virtual events to tune into because it is Juneteenth. So thank you for being here, and hopefully we can all catch some stuff in this afternoon. I'm going to start out with that as archaeologists and historians, we can sometimes get caught up in names and dates and things and places and lose sight about what is most important in the stories we tell, which is the people. And for that reason and many more, I invited Jessica and Barre to join me on this panel to kind of explore how we tell these stories. Archaeology is a science, a soft science, but a science nonetheless, and one that works best when applied through a cross-disciplinary process. We all have different tools in our toolkits for interrogating the past, and it's exciting to see how details we uncover can be woven together to add texture to larger narratives about the Chinese experience in Oregon. I'm going to start out by giving some context about the history of Jacksonville's Chinese Quarter and some information we've gleaned through our excavations there. And then the panelists will have a conversation, which should be really interesting because I'm really excited to chat directly with Jessica and Barre about this topic and share our work. Archaeologists are notoriously terrible at getting the information we discover out of the gray literature and into the wide world so other folks can use it to best tell these stories. So I think we have a lot to learn from each other. Um, and then we'll open it up to general audience questions. So I've told this story a million times, and many of you listening have probably heard at least 1,000 of those versions, but I always try to mix it up a little bit. And today I tried to get more into the details that might be interesting to the panelists and kind of synthesize some parts, and I'm not getting into others as a result. But this is just one small part of this really long, complex narrative of Chinese history in our state. One thing I'm learning, and I'm sure my fellow panelists know this as well, is it's not just what you tell, but how you tell the story. That's really important. Tone matters, nuance matters. As archaeologists, we get to dig through people's trash, literally, often uncovering personal and discrete aspects of their life that was never meant to be shared. And as a result, there's responsibility that comes with that. We want to do our best to tell these stories in a way that's respectful and humanizing rather than exploitative and romanticizing. The stories of Chinese Oregonians have often fallen into the latter categories, as we have more than a century worth of stereotypes, rhetoric, misinformation, and structural racism to contend with as we unpack and interpret our data. These issues are not addressed intentionally and head on. Our stories, no matter how well-intentioned, are vulnerable to misinterpretation, and that can serve to re-victimize the very people we are trying to better understand. I'm going to provide an example of some of these pitfalls as I go through this talk and the history of Jacksonville's Chinese Quarter, and using the data, archival research, and the lessons learned over my more than a decade working there. And that is not to say that I'm done learning. This is an ongoing process. So, since this is part of a larger series, I'm going to assume that many of you know the basics when it comes to how Chinese got to Jacksonville and Oregon. I do want to say that a lot of times the traditional narratives that you can see in secondary literature tends to focus on the many pushes towards immigration, like the famines and the droughts and the floods that force people to leave southern China in search of a better life. And what that can sometimes do is frame these folks as desperate refugees, unlike the other folks that came to Oregon and other places in the West from around the world. And while there were lots of pushes, there were also lots of pulls to lure people. And many of the folks coming from this region had a long history of out-migration to the West and around the world. And they did so as a calculated risk that often paid off and really improved the lives of their families and their communities. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. We want to always get away from the victim narrative when we can, so that we can really get a sense of who these folks were and the amazing lives that they led. And in case you don't know, what is now Jacksonville is located in Southern Oregon, and I'm seeing not where that star is, it shifted a little bit, but down by Medford and Ashland. So you get the picture. Jacksonville as the town was established in 1851, 1852 on the traditional lands of who are now the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz and the Grand Ronde, as well as the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Indians and more. The Rogue River Wars displaced those populations, and as part of this mining process, Jacksonville really functioned as an extension of the California gold mines. We're not far from the border, so people were working their way up looking for gold, and they ended up in Jackson and Josephine County, and population exploded from there. The town of Jacksonville, which was originally Table Rock City for just a short period of time, was established on what is now Main Street, right between Daisy and Jackson Creeks. And like the town itself, it was huddled up right next to the mines. And as folks began to build permanent brick buildings, they shifted over to what is now the main thoroughfare of California Street, and what is called Main Street became the Chinese Quarter within a decade. So by 1860, this is firmly established as the Chinese community in the town. Jacksonville's fate was essentially sealed when the mining waned. Like I said, this is all kind of huddled up next to the mountains on the western edge of the Rogue Valley. So as transportation and agriculture became more important economic considerations, they really lured the train 5 miles west uphill to get to Jacksonville. So it just went right straight through the Rogue Valley. Medford's born, Jacksonville goes in decline. As a result, it's kind of a preservation through neglect scenario. You can see this is a view of Jacksonville in this, well, it's actually late 1880s. And this is a view of Jacksonville today from the same spot. So not much has changed. And what that means is we have this 19th century landscape that is not a time capsule. in fact, there are key neighborhoods missing, like the Chinese Quarter. So people need to remember that that's not frozen in amber. And another, I guess, the happy accident side of that too is that there hasn't been big bulldozers and machinery through Jacksonville. So the archaeology is there, and we just continue to find really incredible aspects of the past history of this community, and much earlier than Jacksonville, as we work as part of, the development and growing infrastructure of this community. So here we are. This is an 1883 bird's eye view of Jacksonville. So this is about as big as it got before it started shrinking with the mines waning and everything shifting over towards other parts of the Rogue Valley. And I think you can see the Chinese Quarter is circled in red. And the main point of our story, or the main pivotal point in the story that I'm about to tell, comes on Tuesday morning at 3 a.m., September 11th of 1888, when a fire breaks out and it burns down the northern portion of this neighborhood. This fire has often been attributed to an arson fire targeting the Chinese community as part of a wave of arsons that went up and down the coast during the height of the anti-Chinese violence, the driving out. But the arson in this case did not target the Chinese community. Instead, it was targeting the Lin furniture mill across the street, and it burned over into the Chinese community. And I always like to make this point because I think it's, again, important to really understand the nuances of anti-Chinese violence. It wasn't always interpersonal or direct violence. A lot of times it was more structural and institutional. So even though nobody threw what they always call in newspapers as an incendiary, a spiteful incendiary, whatever that is, like a Molotov cocktail or something. Arsons were a big thing in Jacksonville, just as an aside. And a woman was actually arrested and sent to a hospital up north for setting all these fires. So, but it wasn't targeting the Chinese. But the fire department prioritized other parts of the community when they fought this fire. Not the Chinese neighborhood. And much of this community had fallen into disrepair. There's vacant buildings. They're kind of old and shambly because of all the local, state, federal laws that prohibited Chinese residents from owning property, from owning businesses, all these different things that led them to live in these neighborhoods that they had slumlords, and there wasn't a lot of incentives to invest in their buildings. So that's kind of part of the impact on the ground of the racism in Jacksonville. Let's see. We think that the Chinese neighborhood had about 300 residents at one point, based on some accounts historically, but it's really hard to tell. What we do know is that there was only like 30 buildings at most in there, so folks would have been packed in. It was largely, probably the permanent residents were smaller, but it definitely ballooned out on weekends and holiday times because people used this as a hub for all the miners working all over the region. They would come in for supplies, for services. There was doctors, barbers, all sorts of different businesses in town that could serve those communities, and for times of celebration and for socializing. So it definitely served a really large community, even though its footprint on the ground was pretty small. In addition, this is another important thing to recognize, especially in rural Chinatowns, not every Chinese person lived in the Chinese neighborhood. This wasn't an impermeable enclave. It was a neighborhood, but there was folks that lived here and worked in restaurants and hotels, or for families, folks that lived in other areas. So that's another thing that we always try to stress as well. But our story is going to focus on this building that this arrow points to. And as you can see, in 1883, it looks like a long linear building. You can't really see the back side of it, but in 1884, this is a Sanborn fire insurance map. These maps could be pretty detailed if you had fire insurance. They're going to note how big your business is and some of the, what it's constructed of. But the Chinese neighborhood, as you can see, they didn't have fire insurance for the most part, so they just get Chinatown shanties, as you can see on the bottom. But this one building, I guess it says number 8 there, that's the building that we ended up excavating in 2012 and 2013. And by this point, it has a bump out on the back. I don't know if that's not present just because it's not in the view of that last photograph, or if it's constructed sometime after that. Here's 1888's view. A little bit's changed, but it's pretty much the same. There's an addition off the front. The thing that's interesting about this is this Sanborn insurance map was created in August of 1888, and our fire is in early September of 1888. So this is a pretty good idea of what this building looked like. I think you can, Jackie, will you nod if you can see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. So this is basically where we excavated right in here where the two parts of the building go together. So archaeology, these businesses, the footprints aren't ever perfect. So it's kind of hard to know exactly where you're going when you put a hole in the ground. But this project was done because the city of Jacksonville and Oregon Department of Transportation needed to put in new streetscape infrastructure connecting downtown with the Brit Festival up on the hill. So they were putting a sidewalk and lights and stuff. So they're coming through. We hit some archaeology. We knew there was a site there because in 2004, the University of Oregon did some excavations up here. In 2008, they did some more excavations here. So all these excavations had indicated, hey, there's archaeological deposits associated with this Chinatown present. We don't really know what exactly they are, but we know there's stuff here. So when we came in 2013 to do mitigation for this sidewalk coming through, we did what we call the wide exposure, and we dug a bigger trench so that we could get not just, hey, cool artifacts, but what is this a house? What are we seeing when we put these holes in the ground? So lucky me, totally a happy accident. I ended up putting our holes right here. So we got two different parts of this building, which provided a lot of really great data. And it made me look really smart to people who didn't know it was an accident. So don't tell. You'll see, we had a lot of public archaeology as part of this project. We've always really tried to make sure that whenever possible, we invite people out and make this process as transparent as we can. And this was a really fun project for that. We put our big efforts, what we thought would be the end of this excavation when we got down to the top, because most of these smaller holes hit this layer and we thought, okay, this is the bottom. But once we had a bigger hole and we could go deeper, we realized that's not the bottom, it was the top. And it was the top of that building that burned September 11th of 1888. So then our next question was, hey, well, what happened when this burned? Did it get kind of bulldozed into a pile? What did the city do with this neighborhood when it was burned? Well, it turns out we were able to use fire science to determine that what you can see here is several feet of fill that was just brought on top. 1888, there's not a lot of incentive to rebuild or expand in Jacksonville. So they just extended a road and they buried this house. So it was as it was when these residents went to bed the night before the fire is how we were able to come down on it archaeologically. So we brought in the fire station, the fire chief, to help us understand what we were seeing, because fire science and forensics, I didn't see why it wouldn't apply to a house that was 130 years old versus a recent house. And sure enough, a lot of their tools were able to help us figure out how this fire behaved in this house. And that in turn helped us interpret what we were seeing archaeologically. So we not only have all the artifacts, but we can use, because again, we're a science, we're taking very careful notes as we go down spatially and marking everything where it was from. We could see, use the fire information and the artifacts and the archaeological data to recreate the furniture and the layout of this house. So we got a really interesting kind of snapshot of a Chinese immigrant household during the exclusion era at 1888, which is really cool. And you can see here, these lines are what we call stratigraphy in archaeology. So these are all the different fill events, modern road fill, historical fill. And then we have these layers of artifacts that are unburned, and then they're interspersed with burned wood or whatever it was, because it was a shelf. So the way fire behaves is if there's something there, and I've seen this in modern fires I've worked on as well. So when there's a cupboard or something, the dishes are preserved because the oxygen's making the fire go elsewhere, and stuff out in the open is subject to much higher heat and burns more efficiently. So here's the bottom of our excavation unit. Now you can see here that this is that transition to that little addition off the north. So here we had intact floorboards, again, because stuff, as the building collapsed, stuff fell down and protected the floor, and stuff burned above where there was oxygen. But we also had a complete set of door hardware. I mean, my dumb luck put this right in the doorway. And so we had the knobs and the door hook hingy thingies and all that stuff. And then here was flagstone in this part, and we think this was the kitchen. We found a dry stacked wok oven along with other food remains, all that kind of stuff associated with cooking and preparing food. A cool thing as well is over here on the side, we found what we first thought was just burned earth as a fire. If it gets hot enough, it can just burn the soil under. But what we realized, because we thought it was like built into a hillside, and then I thought, gosh, that doesn't really make sense. So we excavated through it, and it turns out that this is what I think was rammed earth. So when they when they added on to this structure, they used traditional Chinese vernacular architecture styles, such as rammed earth construction. And we see that in southern China, and we've actually seen it in other places in the United States. I've now seen mining features like reservoir and dams that use the same construction. And there's also, I think the Chu Key store down in California also had it. So that's really cool because, like I mentioned, this community originally started as a mining camp. So these buildings here, this is one of the few pictures we have of the Chinese neighborhood taken from a hill overlooking the back of it. This is across the street from the house we have. Of course, nobody took a picture of that house that I can find, darn it. But we have these other structures, and what we can see is that they are expediently built, not with milled lumber, but with hand-hewn lumber. This is like the early buildings that are going in when this is the mining camp. And then as folks move over and they build, you can see that are starting to happen here in the late 1850s. These are the brick buildings and the bigger buildings that are being built down the road a bit. And so the Chinese residents are moving into these buildings. So everything in our buildings suggests that it was consistent with that. The roof, the nails, are consistent with this type of construction. And we also found that the floorboards, it's kind of hard to see here, but they were pine. The beams, the structural beams were Doug fir, so made of locally available construction and not fancy milled products. So this family or individual or whoever's in the building that we excavated probably moved into a building that was constructed by white miners or other residents, and then they remodeled to suit over time using traditional techniques that they knew. If you could find clay, you could make a rammed earth wall extension on your house. So who lived here? We recovered like 20,000 artifacts. We got a lot of stuff out of that house. And so trying to figure out how it all ties together, of course, is always part of the trick. So one theory is, was it a group of people? Well, early in Jacksonville's Chinese quarters occupation, you had a lot of groups like boarding houses and stuff like that, where single men would live in groups because they're working elsewhere, and the communal living was a thing. That's not really what the archaeological signature looks like to me in this house, and it's much later. There's a lot of vacant houses by this time, so probably not that. So the next, a family. Well, we did find items that would traditionally, gendered artifacts that could be associated with females or with children. However, there's not a lot of good data suggesting that many women or children were in this community. This burned in 1888, so we're between census. We don't have good data for that particular minute in time. But also there are a lot of newspaper accounts after this fire. So we do have some accounts of other residents displaced. For example, Lim Wang lived kind of next door. He had a laundry. He was able to salvage some stuff, and he moved and set up shop again to continue to serve the community. But there's no mention of a family being displaced. And based on the tone and the types of articles that are out at this time, I think that there would have been. So how do we explain those artifacts? Well, one of the toys that we found were 2 cap guns that we did metal restoration on. We could actually still shoot them, which was pretty cool. So one hypothesis was, again, Chinese residents in Jacksonville, Ashland, other places just had a constant barrage of municipal, state, regional, federal laws that just went after anything they could to make their lives challenging. And one of them was they banned firecrackers. So in Ashland, I know that there's newspaper accounts of Chinese New Year's. Folks had to adjust. How do we celebrate some of these things without firecrackers? It's a drag. Well, maybe cap guns as noisemakers could have been repurposed as a creative solution to some of these other challenges. So we don't know, but that's just one potential interpretation. So my theory is a merchant lived there. And again, Jacksonville on the books had a law that merchants, Chinese merchants had to pay $50 a month in 1888 money. I don't even know what that is today, but a lot, if they wanted to have a brick and mortar store. So that was prohibitive because the community wasn't that big ever, but certainly not in the late 1880s. So many Chinese storekeepers would have peddler's license. And I think that this was a creative workaround because most of the goods in this house, I think that there's the volume of goods suggests that they could have been inventory to sell, and the types of goods we had. But also what I think is really cool about this, because whenever you look for oppression, look for resistance, as Beth Lou Williams has said in her work, is that if you've got all these laws and you can't be a merchant, all right, fine, I'm a peddler, because they're selling within the Chinese community, not to the larger community based on the goods. So they could find creative workarounds to these solutions. And I think that might be who we had living here. So what do we have in the house? Household items galore. Most Chinese sites in the West have the similar suite of artifacts, and that's not to say they're all the same. And we don't want to get sidetracked by artifact fetishism, which many archaeologists have historically. We really want to think about these again as a means to the end, the people. So we know that these goods were, many of them imported from China or San Francisco, via San Francisco or Portland. And then we also know that like this Chinese brown glazed stoneware here contained dried, pickled, preserved foods that was imported. And we see that a lot. There was a lot of that in this household. But we also had really cool artifacts associated with actually daily life, like a cleaver. And then this on the right is the wok in situ on this dry stacked brick oven. So we know that these folks were still cooking in a way that you can find in China today. And they had this oven, and it probably was quite lovely to cook there in September when it's really hot in Jacksonville and not have to cook your meals inside. We had a large botanical assemblage. Fire, paradoxically, it's terrible for the residents and for some artifacts, but it's wonderful to preserve. It preserves others great because of the ash. Not a lot of bacteria grows to degrade organic materials. So again, we had plant species that could be locally available, that could have been bought regionally from San Francisco or California, and then stuff that was imported as well. And a really nice suite of artifacts that suggest people were making 5-spice powder, a traditional flavor profile in China. We have all the ingredients for that, as well as there's also some native species that we know have medicinal properties that were used by the indigenous populations for their medicinal properties, but they also are locally available. So we don't know how they ended up in the assemblage specifically. We also have a huge meat assemblage. There's over 50 pounds of bones, which represents an even larger volume of fresh meat. But we were able to do a lot of analysis and see the way that these bones would have been preserved. So we know that on the left, there are a lot of pork mandibles were used for bone broth production, marrow extraction. We have a lot of other cuts. The way that they're cut is distinctive in Chinese butchering techniques. So we know that traditional foods are being prepared with traditional methods. And again, this is not to say that it's static. Some foods and dishes would be the same in Jacksonville or Southern China, but they're not being necessarily experienced or presented in the same way. People are growing and adapting. By 1888, there's a very good chance these residents could have been in Jacksonville for 30 years. So of course, they are Chinese Americans at this point, and they've got their own traditions they're bringing into the mix. We found a lot of poultry. It's hard to tell if it's duck or chicken or sometimes, but we found evidence of egg production on site. Some of the chicken bones had medullary deposits, I think they're called, which shows they're egg-laying hens. We had lots of eggshell. And then again, we had evidence that some of the poultry was being dried and preserved using traditional techniques that I observed in China, and other folks have told me that their parents did. And then it's not all just the day-to-day basics. Again, we want to humanize this population. There's playtime. It's not all work and no play. They're gambling, they're playing games, they're socializing, and we find evidence of that. One cool thing about this assemblage was, like I said, the way fire behaves. If you've got stuff in a cupboard, it's not going to be as burned as stuff out on the open. Well, the gaming table was out in the open, and we had a lot of evidence of really high heat. We had almost a complete assemblage of a fan-tan game probably on the table when the fire broke out, including a stack of cold quarters that melted, lots of these glass gaming pieces and stuff like that that were kind of fused by the high heat because they were out in the open. So lots of really cool stuff like that that can help us get a glimpse into a day in the life of these residents. Writing, a lot of folks assume that Chinese immigrants to the US were illiterate. Some were, but then of course, the population in Jacksonville, there was probably it wasn't a given that anybody could read or write at that time, but we do know that the resident of this house was literate. We found slate pencils and slate boards. This is an inkstone, and I've got a complete one here for comparison so you can kind of picture what it would look like. And then this is one of my favorite artifacts. It's a modified bamboo Chinese porcelain rice bowl that's been cut off, sheared off, and then this is homemade seal paste in the top. So it would have been this basically for a stamp to seal something. We didn't find the seal stamp thing, unfortunately, but that's a really awesome artifact. So again, getting back to my theory that Mr. Chow lives here, this is the only known Chinese language artifact from Jacksonville. It's housed at the Historical Society. And it's basically a wholesale order from a merchant in Jacksonville named Chow to a place in San Francisco. So this is a really cool document that we have, that a lot of the stuff that they ordered matched what was in the household. Medicine, we have a lot of evidence of medicine here. Lots of these traditional Chinese medicine vials. If you have, I know a lot of folks have, they've been misidentified as opium vials. They might have contained an opiate medicine, but they're medicine and not for smoking opium. And in fact, a lot of times they contained traditional Chinese medicines called stone drugs, which are basically minerals, cinnabar, charcoal, lead oxide, stuff like that. Things that can be toxic and if you don't know how to use them, but if they're used appropriately, they can be really effective medicines. We also found calamine lotion and other more common Euro-American medicines here. We do know from some newspaper accounts that Chinese railroad workers had a hard time with poison oak. And so, you know, miners probably did as well. We found bone powder that was stored in a recycled opium can. So that's pretty cool to see too. And we also found parts of a mortar and pestle. So somebody could have been preparing medicines in-house. And again, maybe some of those botanical remains of the local species that had medicinal properties could have also been used in this house. And then I'm going to kind of wind down. I know I'm talking so fast, but I just have so much I want to cover. Talking about safety and security. So again, we don't want to create this victim narrative. So when we first found all these locks and door locks and things like that, the first easy thing that comes to mind and what it can do is support that narrative of the Chinese are always under threat and everybody's trying to attack them. So they have to huddle inside their house and just try to protect themselves. And that's not necessarily true. You know, probably a lot of people had door locks at the time. It doesn't seem too controversial. You don't need to read too much into it. That's just people have locks on their houses. And then a lot of these smaller locks could have been on, you know, where your valuables are or whatever. And these locks on the right, we found a couple of these, I think 3 or 4 of these triangle locks, and they're pretty small. And I know that many folks have told me, and I've seen this as well in China, that they can be used also as talismans and sometimes more decorative, but sometimes these simple ones as well. So there's a lot of ways that these artifacts can have meaning. And again, it's really important not to just cherry pick your data and use it to support these larger narratives that continue to dehumanize this population as perpetual foreigners under threat, scared. We know that these folks were not huddling in corners. They were living in Jacksonville as vibrant members of this community for decades. And in fact, lots of newspaper accounts show that some of the folks that had lived there a long time, as they got old, there's one woman, for example, Tsikoi, who is known as China Mary. She was taken care of by the community. They raised money to help support her in her old age, and then also they buried her when she passed away. So there is a lot of friendship and connections outside of the Chinese community that a lot of people have avoided because it doesn't fit this nice, neat narrative. And so kind of in closing up before I bring Jessica and Barry in is I want to bring it back to the Chinese New Year. That was a really important holiday in Jacksonville, still is today. For folks, it was celebrated for decades. You can trace it out for decades in the newspapers. And sometimes the newspapers are like, oh my God, it's so loud. When will it end? You know, those kind of things. But there's also a lot of other clues to how important it was for the community. We do know from other records that the Chinese population in Jacksonville, not just because of the Chinese New Year, but also the railroad camps and the mining camps and all that, created a huge local hog industry, pig industry. There was a lot of ranchers that would grow these animals and sell them to the Chinese whole hog, and then they'd be butchered and processed to feed these miners, and also during the Chinese New Year. So it was an economic boon. There was a lot of same with chicken was another thing that a lot of folks bought during these times. So it's easy to just see the racist newspaper clip and just read in that and stop the story, but it's really important to read between the lines, to look deeper at how these events and how these moments in time actually served the community. In this photo, for example, I don't know exactly what year this was, but you can see both Chinese and white residents enjoying this celebration. And we also know that Chinese New Year was celebrated in Jacksonville into the 20th century when there was a population in this neighborhood of like 10. And so obviously it was still a draw for Chinese living in other areas. It was still an important enough thing in the community that they celebrated. And we're very excited that about 10 years ago or so, the Southern Oregon Chinese Cultural Association brought this celebration back. And it's once again a really important moment for our community and a way to share this history and to put the Chinese neighborhood back on the map. So people coming and visiting Jacksonville today understand that this was a really important part of our town. That's the built landscape is not there. And so if you want to learn more about this project, because this is just a very small thing, you can go check out the artifacts on the Chinese Material Culture Collection. The link is here. You can also Google that. And I also, Capiolani, I think is going to put it in text or in the chat. And then we also have a Jacksonville Chinese History Tour that one of my students made as a brochure, like a walking tour, but now it's a story map that we're going to continue to grow and add to. So there's ways that you can visit this community virtually if you can't get there in person and kind of learn a little bit more about this story. And so with that, I want to make sure that I have lots of time to give Jessica and Barry a chance to share their work and their perspectives and to talk with them. So maybe we can bring them back on, and I don't know if it makes sense to get my slideshow away. Should I end slideshow? I'll stop share. Okay. Are you guys muted? No. Say something, Barry.
Hey, everybody.
Okay, great. Great. Yeah. So thank you so much for talking with us. And, you know, I've talked to you both individually a lot about this, and I just think it'd be really fun because I think those conversations are so interesting. I thought others might as well, because like I said, archaeologists can be bad at sharing, putting what we're finding in a way that we can communicate it to others without getting super in the weeds and the sciencey details. And both of you to do that so beautifully. So I wanted a chance for us to all to kind of chat about that. So I don't know if anybody wants to go first or make a comment first about how your work interacts with this, and then we can get into specifics.
Yeah, so I'll start. You know, Chelsea, you and I were in China for months, and we saw firsthand this connection between the United States and China, and that it was a two-way connection, which I think is the most interesting thing. So certainly labor was leaving China and headed to the US, but also this flow of information and technology and materials was heading back and forth as well. So, you know, we definitely saw evidence of Western things in China in the 1880s, 80s, just as you are seeing Chinese artifacts in the US.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember, I mean, the first time we were over there, it was like an epiphany every day, because as much as you try to get out of your head and not have all these biases, you don't even know what you don't know. So it really takes spending a lot of time in these villages. And we spent, you know, 2 months just, you know, walking through the streets, and just all the observations we made completely shifted the way that I think about this site and other sites we worked on in Oregon. Jessica,
I'm wondering,
go ahead. Sorry, Barry. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I'm wondering what you thought of as the things that made that shift for you. Climate is one of them for me, and then the materials available, I think, is the other thing that was really interesting.
Yeah, the two things for me were the use of space and the way space was viewed. So when we think about like gardens in Chinese communities, for example, like we all know, documentary record says that Chinese were growing greens and vegetables to supplement food here, and they were eating pretty well compared to other railroad workers or miners. And so I think a lot of us were looking for like a garden plot, you know, something formal like you often see with Western gardeners. But anywhere there was a strip of land, you had food growing, and just a really creative use of the space. And then also, one of the things I noticed as well was the way that you think about private and public space was a little bit different than ours. So a public space, like we saw a monument to World War II that had somebody drying their oranges on it. So it's public, anybody can use it. And here we would think about that the opposite. So when you think about some of the tensions between the Chinese residents of places like Jacksonville and others, a lot of these are just cultural misunderstandings, you know, like people don't understand, they have different sense of boundaries and stuff like that. So when you think about some of the ways that these folks and the white folks in Jacksonville are viewing this neighborhood, there's just some misunderstandings that might be, you know, impacting the way that they're viewing the people. Jessica, you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by actually how much of an art archaeology is. It is a science in the sense that you have to study so much about, mineral deposits, the way fire moves, but there's so much triangulation in what you do with, okay, well, how do I spin a story or create a story based on the artifacts that I found? And you talk so much about looking into the historical reports in the newspapers, learning about what's going on in the census, and also the whole broad scheme of the time and how each of these artifacts play in that scheme. I've been very interested in, because what I do is also spin stories, right? Like usually out of my head. And if I didn't have the artifacts that you have pointed me to, if I didn't have the archaeological background of what I'm writing, then nothing I write would be as believable, and fiction has to be believable. So I actually had a question before we go on any farther is, I'm really interested in, the bowls the people used in Jacksonville, some of the earthenware you talked about, and how much of that overlapped, with what you saw in the Chinese villages. And, when you were talking about pig carcasses, poultry, or even the type of vegetation, like how much of that did you see in those both places, and what did that do for you when you went there? Were like, oh, okay, this is sort of, what we have here.
Yeah, I can speak to this, and I'm sure Barry can too. We saw a lot of the same thing. And again, this is absolutely not to say that the villages we stayed in are frozen in the 19th century. They're modern villages. But there's a lot of these artifacts, or what we see as artifacts, and what is over there, especially the ceramics. It was really cool to see how many different ways they would be reused and reimagined. So I think a lot of times when archaeologists find, especially the brown glazed stoneware things, they can sometimes forget it's a container. It's like a canning jar. It came, nobody was buying the container, they were buying the contents. And then once you had it, you could repurpose it. The spouted jars could be reused as teapots. You would just put whatever you wanted to put in it. And one of the things that I love is a big stoneware jar that had some kind of pickled or dried food in it. Polly Bemis, a famous Idaho Chinese American pioneer woman, she used it as her sourdough crock. So it's basically a crock that can be used for anything. And we saw that in China, people use them for planters, for fences, anything in addition to reusing them for food. So that was really cool. And then the tableware that comes over, it looks beautiful to us because some of it's hand painted and it's got nice designs, but it was purely a utilitarian export. It's not Ming China that would make it on somebody's mantle. And so I think that people kept their bowls, and they would often write their names on the bottom, like peck in their names. So it was like an individual, but they were totally utilitarian. And a lot of the ways that people think about them now, they can, again, that fetishizing them as like these fancy things because it's different than a white plate, but it's important to think about them and how they were functioning. Barry, do you want to?
Yeah, I was thinking about food again, maybe because I haven't had lunch yet. But,
and we ate so well in China.
We did. That's exactly what I was going to talk about. We were so lucky to be able to eat in the village, and the villagers were cooking for us almost every day. And so, you can see right there on the table the fish bones, whole fish, fish served whole with bones, the chicken bones chopped, with a cleaver, the clam shells, all those things are right on the table, right in front of you, and those are, echoes of things you see in the States.
Yeah, and going to the markets in China really helped us to understand what we were seeing as far as the butchering went as well. And I see someone asks on the thing, where did we spend our time in China? Barry and I were in Kaiping, in a village called Chengdong Village. And you can actually Google the Stanford Chengdong Village project and watch a documentary that Barry did all about that work. So we can put a link in the chat to that too. But yeah, so seeing how these products were being butchered, and then also in the winter when we were there, a lot of folks had goose and like bacon, like a sweet bacon kind of thing hanging outside drying, and we could see the preservation happening again in these spaces that you would just walk through, like not private spaces, just like on the streets and everywhere. So I imagine that in Jacksonville, that was probably the same. People were using wherever they could to preserve and create these delicious foods out of the locally available materials. And of course, there was improvising happening as well. It wasn't the exact same product as in China. And we see that by, in addition to all those things that I saw, we found Lee and Parent's Worcestershire sauce and pepper sauce and different things like that. A lot of Chinese residents in the neighborhood were cooks in hotels and businesses, and they were cooking a variety of things. But so there was a back and forth. I'm sure some traditional Cantonese foodways made its way into those, and some of the other stuff they were cooking made its way back into Chinatown. So you get these new flavors. And Su Fan Cheng, who's done a lot of studying on this as well, says that some of these sauces could have had similar tastes to some flavors at home that you couldn't get in the US. So there's also that, what's comfort food, what's new stuff. It's all kind of a mix of all of that.
Jessica, what do you, through your research, if you were to imagine a Chinese merchant in a small town on the frontier in a mining town, and they were to order a meal, what would they be getting?
Well, that's really interesting. I've actually been thinking something along the lines of it. And I don't know if I'm answering the question directly, but I was thinking of that and putting the details of what kind of food they would put on the table. And obviously, what I love about this is, a merchant family of that time would eat very differently from a laboring family, right? A laboring family would probably have less meat, have less access to seafood because of socioeconomic status. But I wanted to actually use your question to go back to the Worcestershire sauce that Chelsea was talking about, because as I was rereading her section of the book, I thought of a scenario that would be so interesting to me, because I'm interested in writing about the humanizing of the families themselves. I could just picture, the parents trying to do Szechuan peppercorns, feeding this kid something healthy, and the kid's like, no, I want Worcestershire sauce because it's more popular. Just like, here in modern
I want
days,
mac and cheese.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I want Velveeta, instead of like, okay, this is more nourishing. This is bone broth.
Yeah.
Like, no, it stinks. That's from old China.
Yeah.
And so those are the things that I picked out from the archaeological study that just spins so much richness into my writing.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers the question, Barry, for you, but I would probably, mostly it's vegetables. When I was thinking about, okay, well, if it's a laboring family, which is my my story centers around a laundry family, usually vegetarian. So then I look through, like, okay, what kind of vegetables? It's probably onions, some kind of potato, sweet potato that was also grown in China. I reached out to Chelsea and asked, what were some of the things that kind of overlapped, that ingredients that they could use in this climate that they would also recognize back in their home climate. Yeah.
And one thing that's really interesting about that as archaeologists, we're still trying to wrap our heads around is in China, they would be vegetarian. In the US, they're not. Meat is cheap. There's so much meat in these sites, all the sites, work camp sites, every site, there's so much meat. So that's been really interesting because yes, in China, most food's going to be vegetarian. Meat's used as a special dish, but here meat is plentiful. So yeah, how is that being experienced? And also we found not only lots of pork, chicken, and some beef, but bear claws and things that traditional, like fancy food in China is in these places here. And how is that being experienced? Is it like, oh my God, I always wanted to try it. Now I can. There's bears walking down Jacksonville. Or is it like,
medicinal? Maybe the medicinal part of it, because bear claw is used in Chinese medicine.
It could be that. Some of them looked like they did have some kind of food preparation, like a marinade or something. So there's a lot of different things we don't understand about that too. Like, is food a symbol of upward mobility, that people here have a way to eat totally different and reimagine their food? And from this site and a lot of others, they ate well, better than the white miners or white, because those folks on the railroad were just eating meat and potatoes and whatever. And in the Chinese, bringing way more vegetables, they got pickled stuff, they got all sorts of stuff, adding a lot more nutrients. We're eating well, and we definitely see that in Jacksonville. So, that's another thing that we don't totally know how that was, what people were thinking about that. Just, we know that the foods they had a lot of different types of foods available. Yeah. Something you want to jump in on?
Oh, I was thinking about rice too, because that's such a staple in China. And is there evidence of rice in Jacksonville, and where do you think it came from?
We did find rice, and we also found rice stalks or rice straw, I think. And that was another thing supporting the merchant idea because it's commonly used as a packing material. We do have ledgers of, we don't have any ledgers of, other than that one order form of inside the Chinese community, but we do know that several merchants in the Applegate Valley where mining was happening early and in Jacksonville sold to the Chinese residents. So there's rice, there's China oil, I'm not sure what that is, and a lot of other things that were imported through. And it was good business. And that's another thing too, like a lot of these merchants, for example, the Kublai store in Applegate where early miners were, they made like $5,000 in a couple years or maybe a couple months off Chinese miners. So it was good business to import this stuff. So again, a lot of these different relationships, you know, folks could then say, hey, can you order this for me? Or can you bring in this? And of course, they're not just ordering Chinese imported stuff. Folks are also buying Levi's jeans and things like that as well. Rubber boots, all different things that you need. So there's a mix. But yeah, rice is coming in for sure. Yeah, and one thing that I have a question for about both of you is in watching the Celestials, a version of that, Barry, you have some oral histories of people talking about artifacts that were handed down from Chinese railroad worker families through the families. And they have even like mundane objects like a watch has this whole complicated story about it. And I'm so fascinated about that because as archaeologists, we see the item, but not necessarily the whole backstory. So that's how we have to use what it's associated with to kind of build that back up. But some of these personal family stories that you have, and we all have grandmother's things or whatever that have similar things to it, you know, those just get lost. So having the oral history as another line of evidence is so cool. And then with Jessica, you have to kind of also make the things in your stories do the heavy lifting of having this, they represent identity and all these other things as well. So I think that'd be really cool to hear your take on those.
Yeah, I think it's, well, so what I would say to the audience is, I would encourage you to start documenting what has happened in your family and what is happening in your family now. Because as I went through these oral histories, you know, we found that there were legends that someone in the family worked on the railroad, but they had no idea where or when or what they did, but they just kind of knew. There were, you know, there are these items that get passed down or were left in safe deposit boxes, but it maybe didn't seem so important in 1920, but became very, very important in 2020. So, you know, I would suggest writing your family's oral history down, using your cell phone to record your elders talking about their childhoods and about the, you know, milestones in their lives. And I would make a little notes around things that they keep and ask and find out why they kept these things. So like you said, the gold watch, there's some, you know, golden spike replica that was handed down, documents. Actually, the Stanford project was huge and they found very, very little new documentation. And actually through oral histories, one of the few paper trails, we identified a paper trail of an immigrant who worked on the railroad and was paid through the railroad. But there's just not much out there. So I actually happen to think we're living through a kind of cultural revolution right now, revolution in culture, and with the social justice movements and so forth. So, you know, if you're involved in that, document it, make recordings, type out some notes.
Yeah.
I want to tag on to, you know, one of the first things that you said and why your work appeals to me, Chelsea, is which is to humanize, right? And yes, social justice, but also have a narrative that's not just the victim narrative. And what I try to explore in my fiction, and I get to have a lot more fun because you guys have facts that you have to present where I can just spin stuff. And for me, you know, what has been astounding growing up and reading, you know, especially American literature, there's so much literature about the West, you know, like you have the big names, Wallace Stegner, Steinbeck, you know, Marilyn Robinson, Cormac McCarthy, and there's so many families and narratives about characters in the West, and where are the Chinese? You know, so what I'm trying to do is write an American novel about the West with the Chinese, where Chinese built California, and the Chinese were in Oregon and in Washington, oftentimes, you know, earlier than the Irish, than the Italians. And, you know, what does that look like, the frontier, what a family would do? And so you know, I think the biggest difference between writing fiction and writing, you know, a scholarly book, you have a lot of research, you have lots of things that are very informative, but with fiction, it focuses on the individual. So it's not about the 5,000 people or the 100,000 people in Chinatown who went against, you know, exclusion by protesting or having a mass civil rights movement. That is important. But really what the reader connects to at the heart level in a novel is the character. And what archaeology does for me is it teaches me, so to make a character really important and memorable is the physical detail you put for a character. And I'll give 2 examples. I was just thinking last night, you know, like Javier Bardem's character in No Country for Old Men, why is he so memorable? He's such a villain because he goes around shooting people with a cattle gun. Like, who does that? Okay. Or in Anton Chekhov's story, you know, The Lady with the Lapdog, there's this scene where a woman is like spilling her heart out to a man, you know, they've just been intimate, and he's there eating a piece of watermelon for half an hour completely in silence. I know it sounds like it has nothing to do with this, but it does, because it's the physical details that talk about a character. And so, you know, when I go through these archaeological facts, like how do I make my family more human? It's okay, it's the parents and their children sitting around eating. And the children's asking, well, where's this bowl come from? Why is there bamboo? Where's the bamboo here? And so then there's more of that interaction between the family that can really, really paint the picture of a family, so the characters stay with you long after you've forgotten what the book is about. So, you know, that's my answer for it.
And I think that's go ahead, Barry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I think it's a great point also, Chelsea, to humanize, and it's what I'm trying to do. Even though it's documentary filmmaking and I'm trying to be factual, I am trying to, create empathy for these people. These people left their, as young, probably young men and women, left their homes, left their mothers, left their fathers, their brothers and sisters, their grandparents, left the only place they'd known to come over here. And I think in American history, we tend to see Asian immigrants as a monolith, and it's certainly not the case. These were people with lives, and people that had lives they wanted to return to as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. And there's this erasure of that history is something that's so surprising. I knew coming into this when I started studying this like more than a decade ago that Chinese population had been stereotyped and romanticized and all that, but I didn't realize how much erasure there'd been as well. Chinese in Oregon were not just involved in mining and railroad building. There were Chinese cowboys in Grant County. There's Chinese buckaroos. We've got photos and names and letters of these people that we've uncovered in that. Who knew about that? That's amazing. And then also, in Southern Oregon, there's a Chinese American family that's had a potato farm for over 100 years. So there's really important Chinese heritage everywhere in the state. And we need to know those stories and to get those details so that it can become more forefront in Oregon history, because so much has been lost. That's fascinating, and it adds this amazing detail to the history of the place we live. I think it's interesting. Yeah. Oh, I think Jackie is trying to talk. Jackie, you're muted. Oh.
Yeah, I'm wondering if this might be a good time to kind of move into a larger set of questions. I don't want to take too much time because it looks like we're going to have ample time for Q&A, which is good. We've got a lot of questions. But I just want to, thank you for really an extraordinarily fine-tuned, but very thoughtful and connected to current ideas and passions presentation on the part of all three of you. This is very, very exciting work. It's fine-grained, it's very thoughtful, it asks important questions. And I think, that what I hope we can get out of this series, and I think we're a work in progress now, we've got another 5, 6, 7 months to go before maybe we have a final opportunity to kind of wrap this all together and say, what did we learn from each other? One of the things that became kind of clear, there was something you said very early on, Chelsea, that sort of struck me about, or maybe it was, no, I think it was Barry saying, everybody who came here, even who were working or came first generation, weren't necessarily illiterate, that there were actually a lot of people who not only were literate, but that must imply some kind of education. And the same is true when you talk about, you know, was this man a merchant because he was literate? Well, probably, but I think that there's some anomalies. I mean, if there's a population of 300 people, I mean, that's the size of New Chinatown when it was first created, and yet there were multiple merchants. And we're in fact railroad workers. It's all these questions. Were people who were recruited for the railroads, were they sons of merchants or farmers? I mean, were these people, many of these immigrants, people who already brought with them, you know, some education, a kind of set of ambitions, you know, that one of these we're trapped in, I think, is this dichotomy between merchant and worker. And I think that's a much more fluid, you know, kind of hierarchy, that someone comes as a worker, becomes a laundryman or a cook. These don't seem to be male occupations even in China. So suddenly, but that's a door opener. And they pretty soon can own a laundry and they can bring a family, you know, and then they can become a labor contractor, and then they can start provisioning railroad workers. And so even this complex set of questions about food, I mean, if we look at records from Portland at the Chinese who are provisioning railroad workers, they're giving them Chinese food and condiments. I mean, so they're not dependent upon meat and potatoes, in other words. You know, so I think that there's a level of sophistication in the Chinese immigrant experience that we've missed because of this, you know, falling into this trap of their victims. And so I really think this is really important. They're very, very important actors. I mean, they really have agency. And this is a huge story. It's a huge story. In addition to, you know, to buckaroos, there are construction workers, people who build buildings. You know, I mean, in these Chinatowns, you know, so out of stone and out of brick. So I guess my question is, if you were, and let's just use the novel as a model, if you were to put together a sort of series of sources that would build upon this really incredibly important bedrock archaeology, what kind of sources, if you had your wish fulfilled, what kinds of sources would enable you to build a more, you know, fulsome story of really what this population was like and what its contributions were to Oregon?
Okay, I guess that's a question for me.
Yeah.
You know, I think, so I think the archaeology alone just tells me so much. And one of the things that I find myself thinking about, how there's no color, right? There's no skin color in archaeology. You're at the bare bones evidence of lives lived, of things that people have touched. Beyond being, you know, I visited Chelsea in Jacksonville. She spent a great amount of time showing me all the artifacts, telling me the stories. I went around some of the mining trails in the area. I also went up to John Day to actually see some of the remainder of the mining site. And what I found fascinating there was, you know, the archaeologist I met there said the remainder, a Chinese mining site is so different from a non-Chinese mining site, just because there's so few items left over. Everything was reused, repurposed in so many ways. Like, you don't have just a tobacco can, right? There's like, or like vegetable can, there's like holes punctured on the bottom, and they're trying to figure out what they use that for. And, you know, like maybe making dumplings and letting the water drain out. It's just the kind of ingenuity that comes with it. I think what's really helpful for me is the tactile stuff that people have touched, that people have left their marks on. You know, also, you know, in going to the Chukki store in Fiddletown and seeing Oswego starch. Then you know, these days we have Google. We're so lucky. It's not encyclopedia and all that stuff to, you know, go through so many archives. You start realizing, oh, that was actually a starch company, and there was some kind of usage of starch from Canada that was brought over. Also, looking up Levine laundry soap and knowing that Levine laundry soap back in the day used to advertise their soap with a string of Chinese laundrymen with their pigtails. It was very caricatured. So all those adds so much more flavor for the time. It helps me understand the friction at the time, but also the camaraderie, like Chelsea said. It's not a victim narrative. There's a reason that these families and these people stayed and were able to prosper. They were able to adapt. They were able to use calamine lotion, Worcestershire sauce. That's evidence of this. I want to maybe evolution of integration. So I feel like keep doing this work. Keep doing this work so people like Barre and I can keep telling stories about it, to keep remembering and share with future generations.
I want Barre to answer next, but before I just want to say the cans with the holes in it, the next in history series is going to be in John Day, and we're doing experimental archaeology. We think those might have been used to sprout things, to make sprouts.
Oh, okay.
So recreating a wok oven. So tune in next month and you can see some on that.
They're doing the hard work for me. They're doing the hard work for me. Exactly.
Could have been a steamer too.
Yeah. That's right. So Barre, you answer, and then I've got some other things to say, but you go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, Jackie, I think it's a pretty interesting topic that you brought up. There's actually some pretty good evidence. Evelyn Hart at Brown University has done some really good research around Chinese that left to go to South America, and on those ships, those passengers had to fill in a log, and they almost none of, they were actually all going to do farming, to do labor, and almost none of them listed themselves as laborers or farmers. There were masons, artists, business people, business owners, educators. Right. So this is, part of leaving your home. Right. Under difficult circumstances. You are only allowed to do certain types of work in other places. Right. So they gave up those things, and if you come to the United States, you go to Argentina or Peru. The only doors that are open to you, and sometimes blocked by law, are labor jobs and merchant jobs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing I want to add to that too is you'd mentioned that some of the jobs like laundrymen, domestic servants, those kind of things are not traditionally male work in China. Well, they weren't in US either, but they were unskilled labor positions that folks could do. And that fact that they did that was used to argue that they were displacing our good women workers as part of the anti-Chinese rhetoric that led to the exclusion laws. But another thing that's important to keep in mind, like Barre said, folks came from all sorts of backgrounds and for all different reasons. It's really, the more I dig into this, the more it's so interesting how much we still don't even know what we don't know. First of all, there's what I would argue is institutional racism and some of the stuff we haven't even tapped into the Chinese language archives. Right. They exist and we aren't using them, which is insane because they just have been ignored. So Kam Wah Chung, I knew even Portland Chinatown has some that were really just scanned and translated. In China, there's the university that we worked with there, Xiamen University, they have thousands of letters home that they've got. So there is those kind of documents out there, which are going to be so fabulous when we get access to those. And so we need to push to continue to try to find Chinese voices into this. But also it's really interesting, the reason why merchants always comes up as an occupation, and that is because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. That was a privileged occupation. If you were a merchant, you could bring in your family. Most cases, even in Portland, it didn't pay well enough to actually support your family. So you had to have your side hustle, like a laundryman, which was considered a labor job. So if you had a laundry, you could not bring your family over. Like a restaurant owner, the jobs that actually made money and were lucrative enough to support families were then targeted by the Exclusion Act, as it was constantly amended as this moving target to, again, discriminate against Chinese population. So most people had to try to maintain a merchant, some kind of complex partnership on paper to keep that privileged status, but they still had to have their side hustles to actually support themselves and their families. So it's a really complicated story, and we just still don't even understand it all. And that very topic, I'm very excited to say, you can read an article that I'm writing with Jackie Chung and Eric Gleason that'll be published in the Oregon Historical Quarterly's thematic volume on Chinese diaspora in Oregon in winter. So there's so much more about, we take for granted, oh, merchants, it must have been a good occupation. It was a strategic choice, just like so many of these things we see. Artifacts are neutral, but they represent choice, opportunity, obstacles. And so they have, you have to kind of understand the context of which to understand them in.
Right.
By the way, Chelsea, $50 in 1888 is $1,400 in 2021.
That's insane.
A lot of money.
That's a lot of money. Obviously, it was meant to be a non-starter. It was a game changer. You couldn't do it.
Right. And we in Oregon had a laundry in 1851. Portland, rather. Portland Chinatown had its own laundry in 1851.
Yeah.
And most of those laundering families, they were families. That's the point. Before exclusion was even passed in Portland, the sex ratio, the gender ratio between men and women among the Chinese community, mainly called laborers, right, was closer to parity than was characteristic of most of the American West. If it was the effects of exclusion and the denial of any possibility, of entry or re-entry of so-called laborers, which is a category that gets to be all-encompassing. That's part of what is happening. That you're taking apart these occupations which have multiple tasks and simply calling them laborers rather than farmers, which is a position of distinction in China, as it was in the United States in the period before the Civil War. So this is all about language, and as well as it's racist language, but it's so subtle and it's so complex. I can't tell you how exciting this is. I mean, I'm very much looking forward to the next two programs, one of which Chelsea is also organized, which is in Grant County, but that'll be followed by the one at Kam Wah Chung. So we're going to have a really great opportunity to continue to delve deeply into the archaeological fabric of this history as it is known, and then begin to kind of think again about one last thing I wanted to say is that the cap guns, I have a number of oral histories from people who love to get out in the street and play with their cap guns, but they were coming from a Chinese-owned fireworks factory.
Oh, okay, cool.
So the family that had the factory, they had access to the cap guns, so they were the favorite kids, in the neighborhood. But that was sort of alludes to the fact that there might have been, since they were doing Chinese New Year's, there might have been some kind of fireworks factory going on in Jacksonville as well. 300 is not a small population for that era, for a community.
Oh, there definitely was fireworks, but then it was outlawed. You couldn't use fireworks after a time. So yeah, and actually there was a soap tax targeting Chinese laundries as well in Jacksonville.
I wanted to say one more thing that I found really fascinating, which is precisely there's a huge difference between the Chinese that were congregated in San Francisco in an urban environment versus the rural environment of Oregon. Because in Oregon, in Kam Wah Chung specifically, where the doctor was actually revered in his community, he had lots of non-Chinese people come to him for help, for ailments. He had all these checks that he didn't cash after he died. He was actually very prominent, and that's the beauty of learning about the Oregon Chinese population, because in a rural community where you're kind of forced to assimilate in some way, it's a very different dynamic, right? And it shows you a different kind of resilience the Chinese had, but also the interaction with the farmers and ranchers and how life get integrated.
As well, Lung On, the partner of Dr. Hay, he was owned the first car dealership in the region. He was a very prominent businessman. They were totally successful.
They were.
For sure.
Maybe we should turn this over back to Tracy so we can do the what 15 minutes left for Q&A. Does that sound good?
Yeah, great.
Okay, Tracy, you're on.
Sure. We have a lot of questions, and thank you to our honored guests for all of your questions in Q&A and chat. So I'll start with a couple that have to do with food and gardening. So Paylin Yu has a question about were there one or more Chinese grocers in Jacksonville, and was there any evidence of terraced gardening plots?
So I guess I'll answer that. So there were merchants in Jacksonville that did sell food, presumably some fresh food. And we do know that there was folks gardening, but we haven't found the remnants. And now that I've, like I said, since going to China, realizing it's not going to be a big obvious garden plot. They're just going to grow food in their yards wherever they can. So I think it was a lot of informal gardening. Today, where the Chinatown sits, I don't think I mentioned this, there are tree of heavens, which are, the oral history is that the Chinese planted those trees specifically there and in other places that they lived and worked. And then we always are on the hunt for trying to find evidence of gardening and that kind of food production on the mining sites. We work with Ginny Popper, who's a botanical specialist of UMass Boston, and she went to China with Barry and I as well, studied a lot of the plants there, and has been helping us kind of track out what kind of species are there. So we don't have great evidence yet, but I know stuff was being grown. I just haven't seen it on the ground necessarily.
And Tom Ewing has a question about those vegetables. Were they imported from China, and what kind of evidence do you have if you can get into the species that you're mentioning?
So we do know lots of food came in from China, pickled, dried, and preserved in those brown containers. So lots of stuff. And some of that stuff was on that slide I showed, lychee nuts, all those different things came in. And presumably, especially some of the greens, the leafy greens would have been grown locally, but a lot of stuff came in. Do either one of you guys have anything to add about that, Jessica or Barry?
I don't remember anything specific. I remember reading about some kinds of vegetables, like how the difference between potatoes here, like, when we think about Western potatoes, it's less of like a rice staple, where sweet potatoes was kind of a food that they try to import, or they were trying to grow, because, sweet potatoes, millet from that region of southern China, at least the part that I'm writing about, was more of a staple food. And here I read much more about the climate being able to grow asparagus. That's more of a Western fruit. Lemons, there's some kind of overlap with oranges, because the climate in Canton is so similar to some. And again, some of my research is more focused on California. So off the top of my head, not too many things, but I know that there was definitely foraging there, especially in rural communities, must have been foraging for berries, for medicinal purposes, raspberry leaves, things like that. Yeah.
And I think too, in the urban areas, definitely a lot of Chinese involved in farming. And in fact, the Bing cherry was developed in part by a Chinese farmer.
Right.
Huge role in hop industry, and like I said, potato farming on the Klamath area. But as far as like personal gardens, I haven't seen much, but I saw somebody made a comment that Warren, Idaho has terrace gardens. And I'm sure that some Chinese communities do still have visible gardening sites.
Thank you so much. Dick Lewis has a great question that I think applies to all four of you. Can you say more about how religion may survive in artifacts that you find?
Barry, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Silence. So what I think of first is in the village, the Chandong village in Kaiping, China, that Chelsea and I were working at. There was a temple there that probably had been there for 150 or 200 years prior, and it was a woman's god temple, and that was disassembled during the Cultural Revolution. And part of the excavation in the village uncovered parts of the original temple. And that was really kind of by luck, wasn't it, Chelsea? It wasn't designed to look for that. But, we found shapes, carved stones, and pillars that were certainly part of the original temple. So in China, there certainly was evidence of religion that was erased or attempted to be erased. And I'm not sure about the Oregon site, though.
Jessica, did you find anything in your work?
I've visited so many temples that were, erected by the earlier Chinese. One of the oldest ones was in Weaverville, California, the Buckeye Temple in Marysville. I think, to me, religion plays a huge role, even if it's not, organized. I guess the context I'm speaking with is both the religion that was brought over, the worship of multiple deities and gods as part of Chinese culture. But there's also, people who converted Methodist to some of the missions in Chinatown because Sunday school taught the Chinese how to read and write. Lots of Chinese went just to learn English and just peaced out, but there were some who actually converted. But I pretty much every single rural town that I've been to in my research, if there weren't a temple, there was at least an altar. In the Chukki store, there was an altar, with peacock feathers, with calendar, with old I guess they were fake or like mandarins. There's always a little bit of difference between the setup, but there's always some kind of setup, which for me is really potent because it's about faith, right? It's about believing. It's about what keeps you human in these times, and what you brought back from the homeland and connecting with the rituals of the homeland. And I think ritual is such a huge thing that the Chinese held on to, and what makes Chinese Americans Chinese to observe these rituals through the generations.
Yeah, and there isn't a temple that we've found in Jacksonville or even heard of specifically, but there must have been one there. Chu Mei Ho, who's the speaker in 2 months, she just had an article with Ben Bronson published in the Oregon Historical Quarterly, this last issue, about the shrine in John Day, which is worth checking if you can. But we do see religion archaeologically in lots of ways. And I really started to understand this more after being in China. Barry and I were lucky enough to be invited to a Taoist, christening of a house, like a housewarming thing. When they built the foundation, they had a ceremony, and this priest set up an altar, and in there, the incense was in a cut-off Sprite bottle filled with sand. And so I realized, like, wow, you don't have to have the specific items. You just have to have the intent behind it. So we also saw incense and oranges, or all sorts of improvised things. So when it comes to in the United States, one of the other things we found that were toys, small parts of a tea set. And I thought, well, gosh, those also could have been used on an altar. The religion is flexible, and that makes it really easily adaptable to new homes. And so it's very transportable. As folks came to the United States and other places, they were able to bring over these traditions, use what they have to just continue to celebrate and practice. And I saw somebody else mention about where Chinese residents were buried. Well, that's another way that we see religion, because folks did make arrangements a lot of times when they came to the United States to have their remains repatriated if they did happen to die in America and they didn't intend to. So they would be buried in a cemetery with a temporary marker. And then after a period of time, they would be moved, sent back to their home village in China. Women weren't usually sent back, and not everybody was sent back for various reasons. And then towards the end of when people had been there for a long time, many people didn't want to go back anymore because then the US was their home. But you see how some of these same, this ancestor reverence and these different traditions do come to the United States, and we do see them archaeologically. And yeah, they're definitely a very vibrant part of the culture, and adaptable, like all cultures are when they move to new places.
Chelsea, you forgot a very fun.
Go ahead, Barry.
You forgot a fun part of the Taoist house blessing. The members, it was just the foundation of the home, and the members of the family had to walk around that foundation. And when they got in front of the priest, he took a big mouthful of water and just sprayed it all over them.
That's right.
It's probably something that wouldn't fly too well here, but.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. I just remembered that that's what happened with the laundry too. That's one of the reasons why the laundrymen early on were criticized, or the Americans thought that they were spitting.
It's the glass pipe and a mixture of starch and water, because their both hands were full and they had to, scrounge for time. So they just, yeah.
And for irony and stuff.
But it was also for bringing up the color of the glistening on various kinds of buns in the bakeries. And I learned subsequent to this that this is also a technique that in Asia, in other parts of Asia, was used to bring out the color on rugs.
Oh.
Rug dealers. So this is quite a technique, and I think we've, again, it's one of those situations where you get this awful image, but it's really, what we're really looking at here is a technique that has been universally used effectively for a variety of reasons. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Jackie, we're just about at time, so I'm hoping to say just one more thing from,
yeah.
Sorry, the one last question I wanted to bring up is from Nikki Mandel, who is asking Chelsea, are you doing continuous excavation in Jacksonville?
Yeah, thank you, Nikki. So this project was an early part of the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project, like was mentioned in the beginning, which is ongoing, and it's looking at Chinese diaspora across the state. So we're heading out in a couple weeks back up to John Day to do 2 more weeks out in the mining camps in the Blue Mountains. We're doing work down here on a railroad tunnel. We're going to be heading out to the Applegate to look at the mining camps of Jin Lin, a famous, very successful miner in Southern Oregon. In Jacksonville, they are redoing the fire station at some point soon, and that is on the site of a Chinese hotel that was the site of several women that were busted for prostitution a few times. So we are going to do some archaeology there, and I'm very excited to get a chance to see some artifacts, hopefully associated with Chinese women living in Jacksonville. So there is always more work to be done in Jacksonville. We're going to be working on a brewery, the Eagle Brewery as well, not Chinese, but another cool site, and lots of opportunities to continue to learn more about Chinese heritage through the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project. There's a Passport in Time project with citizen scientists going out to join professional archaeologists next week. And then we go out after. So lots of ways to continue to follow this story as it unfolds. And then hopefully we'll get all our data to Barre and Jessica, and they can continue to spread the word through their various mediums as well.
Thank you, Chelsea. Jackie, back to you.
Yes, and just really briefly, thank you all again for an incredibly wonderful series of presentations. And thank you to everyone in the audience. I know we have quite a few new people today and who will have signed up for this series. Please tell your friends. I think this is path-breaking, and we hope by the time we get to March of next year, that we might have actually even a larger roundtable involving not only speakers from this series, but possibly from the authors of the volume that Chelsea has alluded to being published in the winter edition of the Oregon Journal of History. And in the meantime, please get yourselves on the mailing list if you can. You can do that on the website. And please tell your friends about the next program, which will be in the middle of July, on July 17th, about the Malheur National Forest. I think that actually Tracy has a more detailed piece of this information to give you. So I'll just say goodbye and thank you again.
Sure thing. Thank you, Jackie. Yes, if you did enjoy today's program, stay tuned for our July 17th program in the Hidden Histories series. It's called Of Woks and Men, Chinese Mining Camp Cooking in Eastern Oregon. It'll be presented by archaeologists Dawn Han, Katie Whippy, and Jocelyn Lee. And this presentation will provide a filmed introduction to historic Chinese placer gold mining, recent excavations at Chinese mining sites on the Malheur National Forest, as well as the result of replication experiments at those recent excavation sites. As Jackie mentioned, check out our website, www.portlandchinatown.org, in the next few weeks, and you'll find more information about the Hidden History series there. Thanks everybody so much for joining us on this beautiful Saturday, and feel free to reach out to us and let us know what you liked. With that, we'll end. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barry and Jessica.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barry, Jessica, Chelsea.
Thank you.
Chelsea, this is a really good book.
Oh, yay.
Yeah, I really enjoy it. Yeah, for sure.
Barry, have you seen Last Cow? The film.
Say it again.
Last Cow.